All right, we are live. Welcome everybody to the culmination of our 6-week mini-series on the Middle East and North Africa startup ecosystems. We have an awesome lineup today full of speakers and panel sessions for you guys. I'm super excited for this. This has been about 3 months in the making, and we're going to have a lot of fun today. We're going to get right into things very soon, guys. We'll bring you up. Let's see. All right. All right, everybody. So we have with us a lot of speakers, panels, and our 2 finalists from Pitch MENA Live, which is a 16 startup live stream pitch competition that some people have been calling American Idol meets Shark Tank for Middle East and North Africa startups. We've just completed the American Idol format the past week, and we'll feature 2 live Shark Tank pitches today for real money. Pitch MENA Final Lives will kick off in just about an hour and a half from now. But before and after, we have 2 sessions that will each unpack some of the major themes from one of our podcast episodes from this past 6 weeks. And if this is your first time tuning in, I'm the host and executive producer of the Global Startup Movement. We're a Washington, D.C. based media insights organization that provides candid insights and analysis into emerging market tech and innovation industries. And if we're just meeting here for the first time, you might have missed the 6 podcast episodes that we've been publishing every Tuesday morning since January 6th. So as you're tuning in right now, guys, go to your favorite podcast app, search for the Global Startup Movement, and hit that subscribe button to get all 6 podcast episodes for free. It's some of the best content that we've put out to date, and I'm super excited for you all to listen to it, and super excited to have you guys with us today. So if you guys haven't been tuning in, this is what you've missed. Again, we've been publishing every single Tuesday since January 5th. We've had 6 episodes. We've had 27 stakeholders of the MENA startup ecosystem featured. And that's everyone from angel investors, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, ecosystem builders, everyone that's involved in the Middle East and North Africa startup ecosystems. You can hear their podcast series. And I want to be sure, guys, to give a huge shout out to our presenting sponsor for this entire mini series, the Export-Import Bank of the United States. We're going to be joined later on today by Ursula Wegzernovich, who is a representative from there, and she's going to be walking us through some of the awesome financing and credit risk services that they provide to U.S.-based businesses. And we're going to discuss how the Middle East and North Africa diaspora here in the United States can better engage with the startup and the business ecosystems back home. And again, guys, as I mentioned before, this is the culmination of our Pitch MENA Live series. The teams have been battling. We've had 16 teams from Dubai, Saudi, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, all over the Middle East. And we've narrowed it down to 2 finalists, Finlec, who is a Dubai-based fintech startup, and Al Guru, who is an edtech startup that is focused on the Saudi Arabia market. But first up today, we have a good friend and a fellow startup ecosystem builder, Eli David, who's going to be joining us to kick off today. So let me bring him up onto the stage. Eli, welcome.
Andrew, thank you very much for inviting me. Super exciting to see the work that you're doing with the MENA region. And
What's the weather like in Cape Verde today?
So actually, I'm not in Cape Verde. I'm in Canary Islands.
Canary Islands. That's what I meant. Yes. Same thing.
I was in Cape Verde in November. We also work with them. But yeah, beautiful weather in Canary Islands, and definitely recommended. A nice ecosystem as well. Good tax benefits if you're interested. So yeah.
Awesome. So I see about 143 of you guys tuning in right now. I'm really excited to be with you guys here today. I see a lot of you are actually over on YouTube. So feel free to pop on over to Hopin. We're keeping that very, very curated, high quality. And I want to make sure we facilitate a lot of networking on that platform as well. But Eli is going to kick us off. He's the CEO and founder of Startup Link. They're one of the leading data platforms that features a very comprehensive startup ranking of the global startup ecosystem. And so we're going to dive into some of the Middle East and North Africa ecosystems on his platform. And we're going to figure out how we can get more Arab countries into the top 100. Because Eli, I noticed that I believe one of the only ones that are up there is Dubai. I might have missed a couple more. I think Cairo might be up there. It's a possibility. Riyadh is, there's some momentum building there. But why don't we get into what you have for us today?
Excellent. Yeah, would be happy to share a very exciting region, and there are some really nice advances there. So we're really happy to see what's going on with the rise of new ecosystems that before were not that, let's say, active, and now they're super active. Andrew, what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to share my screen maybe, and
yes,
tell me if it works. So just a second. So share screen. I'm going to do a quick intro about what exactly are we doing in Startup Link, and then kind of presenting also the results as well. So Andrew, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Super. Good. So let's quickly, just an introduction about what we do. We have startuplink.com. It's a global startup ecosystem map that is open for the public. And basically, over there, you can filter startup by industries, co-working spaces, accelerators, leaders, and so on. We take all this data and we are basically putting it all together, computing it to understand what is happening in the specific ecosystems around the world. Currently, we have databases of thousands of cities and 200 countries. So it's really nice to see, basically take the data and then basically try to figure out what are the implications on the cities and countries. What are the trends? What are the momentums? Just as a side note, the site is open for everyone at startuplink.com. And if you want to support the rankings, the upcoming rankings of your city and country in the next report, if you can add your startup there, would be absolutely great as a patriotic act to your city and country. I'll just say that a lot of the data is being received by the users themselves. Other than that, we work with a few dozens of governments, municipalities, economic development corporations, also working with Crunchbase, SEMrush, and other, let's say, global data partners that we supplement a lot of data from there. Our goal is to basically uncover the truth and the momentum about what's happening currently in startup ecosystems around the world. There is a report that is published on an annual basis. You can download it at report.startuplink.com. It's becoming relatively an authority on where to go next. And I just want to say a little bit about, the topic of the rankings and why do they matter. I do believe that we entrepreneurs, we have to find the right ecosystem for us. And the world is relatively open. Even in COVID time, there are always opportunities. And it doesn't mean that we have to get stuck specifically in the place where we were born or where, let's say, our family is. And the idea is that we really believe that the choice of the location is going to greatly impact your chances of success. We're not only dependent on us, our ecosystem is giving us many, many benefits that are relatively invisible, but are happening with time. Interesting people to meet, investors, co-founders, suppliers, clients, and so on. This is happening in the good ecosystem. So just as a side note for our entrepreneurs here, pick the right ecosystem for you. It doesn't have to be the place where you're at now at all. Of course, those rankings are also allowing decision makers to decide how to develop their ecosystem. Are they doing well or bad? Some ecosystems are not doing well, and that's important to say. And we also are great believers that ecosystems have a narrative, and those reports and rankings are allowing to change the narrative. So I would just say to our entrepreneurs friends here, if your ecosystem is doing well, try to promote it, celebrate it, and so on. The algorithm that I'm going to show you the results on is focused on basically all this data that is being fed into the algorithm and 30 different parameters. And before we...
And Eli, real quick, is weather? Do you take into account weather? Because I'm assuming if you do, Dubai would probably be top 10, right?
Exactly, yeah. So what we're taking into account is more the results. So of course, everyone goes to Dubai because of the weather, but the idea is that we're taking very much into account, we're measuring success. And the reasons for the success, we leave it to people to decide for that. But basically, by measuring success, we're mostly measuring how many startups, how many co-working, how many accelerators, what's the quality, how much traction do they have, unicorns, global companies and so on, VCs and so on, and of course also the business parameters as well. So it's kind of like a mix max of a lot of things so we can get a specific result. And actually, Andrew, tell me later if you're interested for me to elaborate a little bit on the global results, because I think some of us are not going to stay necessarily in MENA. I might go, but I will just jump to the local results now. That's a few slides on the global result. MENA. So basically in the Middle East, currently we have 9 countries that are being ranked, and I want to congratulate Kuwait. Kuwait for the first time basically made it to the rankings. As you can see here, the 9 ecosystems that are ranked are Israel, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Lebanon, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Kuwait. I do want to say that we have one more ranking on Africa. So the North African rankings will appear in Africa, and I will dig the results for you soon, because Egypt does have a great ecosystem as well. And we're also tracking, if I'm not mistaken, Tunisia and Morocco for sure. So those are good ecosystems over there. On the country level, you can see that UAE is the one that is basically opened a little bit of a gap. And if we go to the city level, you can actually see that, as you mentioned, Andrew, Dubai is the only ecosystem in the top 100 global ecosystems from the Arab countries. Cairo, if I'm not mistaken, is not there. Dubai is super interesting for us. And you also see a very good momentum. It jumped by 40 locations in the last report. So that's good news. Other than that, you see really good momentum. I think, Andrew, you mentioned Riyadh. Yeah, Riyadh actually finally is closing gaps with the other ecosystems. Amman as well is the second highest ranked ecosystem in the Arab world, but this is not taking into account Cairo that I have to check.
So Eli, real quick, I wanna point out, I think it's a hugely like there is something to being a big fish in a small pond, and a lot of startup ecosystems, like you can be that. But when you think about the Arab world, when you think about Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, like being a big fish in a small pond in one of those cities, you have a pretty big advantage because there's a lot of money there. There's a lot of momentum there. And again, weather. I think weather is actually a really, really important thing now that because of COVID, everyone is locked up. All you need is internet, right? And so you might as well be in somewhere that's super nice. So I'm pretty sick of Washington, D.C. I'm looking for somewhere maybe, Canary Islands is the move, but I'm really bullish on the Arab world in the wake of COVID for sure.
I totally agree with you. I think Dubai is the one that has probably the best momentum currently in the Arab world. We're also seeing, Andrew, the migration of people from the Arab world to Dubai as a hub. This is something that usually happens in hubs. Once a hub is getting very, very popular, people are understanding that there are serious network effects in being there, and you see a lot of transitions as well. I do want to say that you don't necessarily have to go. I think we talked about this a lot, Andrew, about, you don't really have to go to the San Franciscos of the world. They're going to be very, very expensive. And it really depends on your ambition. So in a way, you also have to look at your vertical. Let's say if you're doing hardware and IoT, you probably want to go to Shenzhen in China. If you're doing fintech, you probably want to go to Dubai. So those are things that you have to take into account. But yeah, Dubai is becoming a very interesting ecosystem that has, I think it has the ability of becoming, in a way, the new Tel Aviv of the Middle East in some capacity. So I'm very, very bullish about Dubai. Yeah.
Awesome. And did you stop sharing your screen, by the way? I don't see it anymore.
Yeah. We're done with the presentation, but yeah.
Got it.
If you want, I can show also the global ranking, just in case people want to see something outside of MENA.
Yeah. Why don't you put it up there just so we have some little background while we chat here. But I do want to dive more into kind of the underlying data that you're pulling for the platform. I think what you're doing is super unique because I'm just sick of like people looking at VC available or VC funds in a specific city as like the gauge of an ecosystem's health. Because like, if you just look at venture capital available, like there's no kind of underlying health pulse that you're pulling from when you're just looking at that number specifically. And so I think what you're doing when, pulling from Meetup data, I'm sure you pull from Crunchbase and a lot of other platforms, but I'd love you to just talk a little bit more about like the data sources you pull from and maybe some of the factors that you're considering that, bigger players that are just looking at the VC money available might not be considering.
Yeah. So a quick word about VCs. Basically, one of the things that we're not doing is measuring investments. Why? Because at the end of the day, I think investors are super critical in an ecosystem, but in many cases, the data is not really there because a lot of those deals are being closed without anyone knowing. That's one. And second of all, also, you have a lot of government involvement and sometimes organizational involvement in investments and grants and so on that are not actually reflecting on the results. So the way that I like to look at it is that, investments in a way is watering a plant. But what we measure in Startup Link is how high the plant reached. So in a way, we're kind of saying, look, if VCs are very important, investors are very important, and you have a good VC ecosystem, really a good one and not a toxic one, then the plant is going to grow. And we're measuring the results. On the results, we're measuring how many of those entities actually exist. Like, if you're going to arrive to a specific ecosystem, are you going to see a lot of startups there, or it's going to be a little bit of a desert, that nothing is happening there? This is something that is very important for us. You mentioned Meetup. We're checking things like how many communities and events are there. Like, once again, if you're going to arrive to a place, are there going to be a lot of options for networking and communities and so on, or are you going to arrive and feel by yourself? Nothing good happens when you're alone in a startup ecosystem. Basically, a startup ecosystem that does not create some kind of a network effect, a community effect, it's relatively a dead startup ecosystem. And in addition to that, we're checking results. The amount of unicorns, the amount of scale-ups, the amount of massive companies that have generated from a specific location, the traction. We have tools basically with a company called the SEMrush to check also the traction of each website. And it's nice that there are 1 million startups in a location, but actually are people using them as well. So this is one more thing that we're checking as well. So when you put all of those together, you can kind of get some kind of a score, a total score. I have to say the score is probably not accurate. There is a lot to improve, but I still think it's a relatively good estimation to what is happening currently in the world. And once again, we as entrepreneurs, we have to use this data because we cannot allow ourselves to be in an underperforming startup ecosystem. The implications are that you're not going. The problem is, Andrew, you're not even going to see the implications because you will never feel the pain of an investor that you didn't meet. You will never feel the pain of a co-founder that you didn't meet. But it would happen. Like if you would go to a place like London, compare it to a place, I don't know, like a small city in Bosnia, you would have a lot of opportunity cost that you would not feel, but it's there. And you would only know it if you're in a place like London. So in the end of the day, I do recommend to pick a vibrant ecosystem. It doesn't have to be a top ecosystem in the world, but at least a place where things are happening. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, there's a couple of surprising things for me on this list right here. Like, I'm really surprised that Saudi Arabia is actually super low on the list. I would expect it certainly to be ahead of Qatar and Bahrain just because they're super, super small markets.
I'll explain a little bit about the countries and the cities. Okay. There is a little bit of a difference in the countries and the cities. And the difference is that on the countries, we also judge you on how much population you have. And because Saudi Arabia has a lot of population, we expect more from Saudi Arabia per person when we do per capita in a way, than what we expect from a relatively smaller ecosystem in a way. So this is something that has to be said, that the countries, what we do on the countries is compared to the size of the population, but on the cities themselves, we let loose. We do not do any normalization according to the size of the population. So over here, you can see that actually Riyadh is the third highest ranked Arab ecosystem, even above Abu Dhabi, above Tehran, above Beirut and Jeddah and Manama. So we do see it, but when you look at the country, because the country is so big with so many people, we expect more than that. By the way, you can see that in Saudi Arabia we have Jeddah making it for the first time to the rankings as well. So that's really good news as well.
Awesome. So one thing that I've never heard you mention that I do want to discuss with you in terms of like pulling data on startup activity. I'm pretty keen on specifically GitHub. If you look at GitHub activity, I think that's a pretty interesting indicator of actual startup activity in an ecosystem because it shows how active the developer community is. And I believe GitHub is an open platform, and same with GitLab. I think they're open enough to where I think you can pull some data. So I would actually love to see that because it takes into account the actual development talent that's being built and is active in that ecosystem. Have you ever thought about that?
So now I'm going to put it on my list. This is great. So we're going to be one of the, like always, where I'm taking ideas from you wherever I can. I do want to say,
I'll send you the consulting fee once we get off the call. $5,000 invoice. Just let me know.
Gonna delete you from WhatsApp just after the call. Yeah. But I do want to say something about the developers, and this is something that is interesting. Sometimes an abundance of developers is not necessarily a good indication for a startup ecosystem. I'll tell you why. Because sometimes when you have a low-cost ecosystem where it makes a lot of sense to become a freelance developer and so on, in some capacity, you have a lot of high quality, high talent developers that are working for companies from the outside. So, or they can work for a Google or whatever in the city, or they can actually work for clients from the rich world, from USA or Norway or whatever, and get a lot more money. So sometimes we actually struggle with understanding if the influx of developers is a good thing or a bad thing, because at some points, in some places, for example, Poland and the Ukraine, the ecosystems could have been so much better if a lot of the high quality developers would actually work on their own projects. So I totally agree. More developers, more power, more startups. However, there are some elements that are sometimes pushing developers for working for other companies, especially if it's a low cost country. And then you have a great arbitrage cost of working for a client in a rich country and so on. So this is something that we're still testing, but I love this. I'm definitely gonna add this to the algorithm and see if there is a way to kind of pinpoint the city that is connected to the developer. So yeah,
that'd be cool. That brings up an interesting point. What do you think about someone? I think there's been a shift in a lot of ecosystems viewing someone like Google or Facebook establishing an office or a hub in their location as like it's shifted from maybe a good thing to a bad thing. And I think it is a double-edged sword, because what happens when Google comes in, establishes an office in, say, Warsaw, which is a big conversation I had like last year. There's a possibility that Google is siphoning off a lot of development and tech talent in your ecosystem. And instead of, that developer talent actually working on projects that are, high growth startups, they're getting sucked away and just getting jobs at Google. I guess the flip side of that is you have Google coming in and potentially training the next generation of developer talent. I don't know. Do you view, like, how do you view something like that? Like a big tech giant coming in, establishing a huge campus in an ecosystem that's maybe a little bit underdeveloped. Do you think that's good, bad, or, a little bit of both?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, or as the answer that everyone gives, when they're not sure, it depends, right? Because it really depends, I think, on a few elements. The first thing that you would like to check when you check something like this is actually, at the end of the day, what I understood is that startup ecosystem in many, many cases are the psychology of the local population. According to the psychology and mindset of the local population, you can actually figure out if something is good or bad. And psychology is very, very difficult to measure, by the way, Andrew. It's one of the most complicated things on the planet. So I would say that basically, if you feel like your local startup ecosystem, if your local entrepreneurs or local population is very, very into risks, taking risk, and is very entrepreneurial or independent, bring the Googles and the Intels and all of them. For example, in Israel, there are big centers of Google, of Intel, and so on and so on. At the end of the day, people will always want to work on their own startup. However, if you go to a place, let's say like Portugal or Spain and so on, that are a little bit more conservative style, that there is a lot more pressure, social pressure from family and from friends to basically stabilize, become, have a dignified work and so on. Bringing a Google or a Facebook there will result in someone staying very much long-term probably in this company, and not in Israel, they would probably leave. The first minute that they have a little bit of savings that they can work on their startup, because that's the only thing that is in your mind. In other places, it would be a little bit more difficult. And I would also say that it has to do with the phase of the ecosystem. So I would encourage to bring the Googles and all of them in the beginning of the ecosystem, when it just, starting to get some critical mass, and then it can greatly help. However, at some phase, it's not necessarily something that you have to work hard for. It might even be do more harm than good, like you said. So complicated topic. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, guys, I see you over in YouTube. I see about 139 of you watching in YouTube. Feel free to join us in Hopin, guys. That's where we're going to do all the networking. I don't think I can see numbers here on whoever's in Hopin. But if you are in Hopin, welcome. If you look on the left side of your screen, there's a networking button, and that's where you can basically join in one-on-one networking sessions. The email list for this virtual conference was very highly vetted on the Hopin side. So rest assured that if you do use that networking feature, you're going to be connecting with a really high quality person on the other end of the screen. And really, guys, if you tuned into our pitch competition over the past 6 weeks, we're looking to connect the region. Like, the platform that we're building here is something that, we believe startups are a force for peace, especially in the Middle East. And I think we're seeing that now with Israel, UAE, Bahrain. And the pitch competition, the final four was an Israeli startup, a Saudi startup, Palestinian startup, and an Egyptian startup. And so, guys, that's what we stand for here. Eli, let me ask you a question. What do you think about when you think about like the MENA region's conflict zones? What do you think about startup ecosystems in that context? Because there's a lot of arguments that, well, first off, we have to put more money into developing social programs so we can get some stability in the region before that, before we invest in private sector funds, before we invest in SMEs and startups. I think, again, it's kind of a situation where it does depend. But generally, like, I just wish a lot of this money that goes into social programs would just go into private sector funds, because the youth have a very different perspective from the parents' generation. I think the youth are tired of politics. I think the youth see the opportunity to use the technology they have at their disposal, not only to sell their services and products into the global market, but to just move on, right? And just heal these stories that we've all kind of bought into the past few decades. What do you think about that? Like, the dynamic between capital into social programs or capital into private funds?
Yeah, I think first of all, definitely you don't want to wait for your public sector to lead the way. Usually the private sector is leading the way, right? So the idea is that on conceptions, on things, on geopolitical developments and so on. So the idea is do think what is best for you, what is best for your startup, promote your startup. Also, if you have to relocate, the same idea exactly over here. I will say on the geopolitical level, there is a good, there are many countries in the world that have a tough geopolitical situation. And I think the same is in the Middle East as well. The best thing you can do when you have a tough geopolitical situation is build a strong startup ecosystem that creates a strategic advantage, that creates the need of others to connect with you, alliances and friendships and so on. So I do want to tell you, all of you that are in your country, whichever country it is, there is a patriotic element in staying in your ecosystem, in helping other startup ecosystem founders, other founders in your ecosystem, helping, sharing information and so on. Your city is stronger, your economy is getting stronger, and the social element as well is getting stronger by work from the private sector as well. So I truly believe that in many cases, especially in places like the Middle East, we can't really wait for, let's say, policymakers to save us. And each and every one of us that is starting a startup in a way saying, look, I'm interested in creating my own universe, my own microcosmos of the universe, my own company that is doing a dent in the world. And I think this is a very powerful declaration of basically, look, I'm not waiting for anyone. I'm just now running my own value proposition to the world. And I think it's a beautiful thing. So definitely encouraging to do more work and be in the private sector and build your company. I don't think there is anything better than that.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. And I've been developing this thesis actually that countries that are more inclined to nationalism have stronger startup ecosystems. And I think that's the case when you look at the US, Brazil, China, Nigeria, Israel. Like, a lot of these countries, it takes some sacrifices in the early days of the ecosystem where you need those angel investors that are willing to write a check to a startup where there's no ecosystem or support system around that startup. but they're willing to write that check and take that risk because they believe in the kind of greater good that's being seeded, by this small angel check. Guys, if you go back and listen to the first 2 episodes of our podcast series, again, just go to your favorite podcast app, type in the Global Startup Movement. We had Zachariah Yahya, who is from Gaza. He's a freelancer that basically graduated from university, had absolutely no job perspectives, no opportunity to make money around him. And he just started doing Arab to English transcription services on Fiverr. Started very slow, started to build some momentum. And now he's making thousands of dollars every month, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month. He's able to support his family. He's able to support his parents. And it's a really beautiful thing. And also, it shows that these technology platforms that we have at our disposal are tools. They're just tools that enable us to unleash our imagination, really, is what they allow us to do. And so even if you are an ecosystem like Yemen, where there's just, or Syria or Gaza, or Libya, where there's no support system, there's no venture capital firms. You have global freelancing platforms that you can sell your services into. You could earn at US dollar, right? And that converts super well into your local currency. And so we need a broader conversation beyond, again, this refers to what I was talking about before, Eli. Like, the conversation needs to go beyond just venture capital. Just here are the venture capital funds. And so this is how healthy the ecosystem is, right?
I would just add, Andrew, that one of the most important things, if we speak about patriotism and nationalism, is that if you have a successful startup and you've made an exit, one of the things that we're checking in our research and is very validated is what happens when people sell their startup and making an exit. In relatively countries where you have low patriotism or low connection to the country, usually people will just take off to a European country or to the USA with the money, say thank you very much. They did great, and they might even continue their branch in the country and employ people, but that's where it ends, basically. In the countries that really made it big, the people that managed to sell their startup became investors, and they now invested in an ecosystem of their own. For example, in Estonia, you had this with the guys that did Skype, and when they sold Skype, basically the Estonian ecosystem, they called it the Skype Mafia, and the Skype Mafia basically funded all the current successful Estonian companies. The same thing happened in Israel. A few really good, high-quality companies about 20 years ago, the investors didn't take off, and they said, no, we're now becoming investors, and we're putting more money in the ecosystem. So the only request I have is wherever our listeners are from, that if you make it big, and it's very difficult to make it big, it's only a very, very low percentage, take a moment to think about, can you actually support the next generation of entrepreneurs after you? I think you would create a much bigger legacy than just a success story, but you would also nurture an ecosystem, and it really works. You look at it 20 years after, and you see that the investors that stayed are the ones that made a lot of sense, and most of them were successful entrepreneurs before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very true. And when you think about the multiplier effect that a large exit has, like you said with Skype in Estonia. Estonia is such a small country, Estonia in and of itself is kind of a startup. It's such a young country that, has leaders that are in their 30s, early 40s. And I think that what they're doing in terms of their digitization strategy, their kind of e-visa, e-resident strategy, it's super forward thinking. And Estonia is actually, I think, is a really good model for some of the smaller ecosystems that are in the Middle East. When you think about UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, like, it's similar to Estonia, where it's very small population, very dense, concentrated, but the GDP per capita is super high relative to the rest of the world. And so you have kind of a base and a base consumer spending power that's there. It just needs to be cultivated. There needs to be a balance of nationalism, right? A Goldilocks level, not too much nationalism, not too little nationalism, just right in the middle nationalism, I think, is the right thing to hit.
And also you need a good dose of marketing. Andrew, both you and me know about
Dubai is pretty good at marketing.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So the idea is, I know that as well. But the idea is, look at Estonia, 2 million people, and you and I know about it, and probably half of our crowd knows about Estonia. So the idea is also, we also look at a city or an ecosystem as a product, and we always tell the entrepreneurs as well, try to spread the word, because the Estonians basically built a marketing campaign to market their ecosystem. Although their ecosystem is relatively, I have to tell you, it's not the most. There is a reason I'm now showing you the list of all the global startup ecosystem that are ranked, not necessarily in the Middle East. You would not see Tallinn in Estonia there, but still, they've created such an effective marketing campaign and built such an effective narrative that they're closing gaps. And that's one more thing to do. Always try to market and broadcast your ecosystem. I think what you're doing with your MENA project and the podcast is exactly that. This is a step in the right direction. Each country has to understand it's a global challenge to keep your talent, to avoid the brain drain. And you just want to be in a situation that you don't only have a good product, which is a good ecosystem, you also need a good marketing and sales team. And that means broadcasting your ecosystem globally. And that's very, very important.
Yeah. And I also think it means cross collaboration with other ecosystems. I think a lot of the MENA ecosystems are super similar to sub-Saharan Africa. Like when you show me the Saudi Arabia numbers, like it's like, okay, this is just Nigeria, but over here, it's like this, it's very similar ecosystems. And so a lot of entrepreneurs that are operating in these markets, if they're not paying attention to the global, marketplace, they might not be aware that this edtech product that we're building in Saudi Arabia, actually, this is the same exact solution that we can just bring over to Nigeria, and it's a huge, it's a perfect product market fit for the market that they have there. And so I think there are a ton of parallels between MENA and sub-Saharan Africa. There's a ton of parallels between MENA and some Southeast Asia countries. And also, when you think about something like Israel's ecosystem, the reason that Israel is super successful is because that they have a test bed, a very, very small market where they can quickly and rapidly test products. And then they just go over to the US because it's a huge homogenous market that they can attack. And because they have that Israeli chutzpah, I mean, they come over and they crush it here. And I think there should be a lot of parallels between other ecosystems like Dubai. You test in Dubai, you establish product market fit into Dubai, and then come over here to the US.
Totally agree. And the idea of a small ecosystem like Israel or Estonia, for example, is that you have a disadvantage because your market is not big. But at the same time, you also have an advantage because at the end of the day, you're saying, look, I'm not going to develop for the local market. What are 7 million people or 2 million people are going to do for the bottom line of my business? So the idea is that when you're actually locked a little bit in isolation and you don't have some kind of an easy local market where you can develop, it actually pushes you to become international from day one. And that's something that we've noticed as well, that those ecosystems that are kind of like, look, we have no one to sell to. We have too little population. We have to go full speed ahead. They're really successful on a global level. However, there are big advantage of having big market. And just like you said, the MENA region, أغلبية الناس يحكوا عربي, we all speak Arabic, so the idea is that when we speak Arabic, we can sell to the Arabic market. And I think it's also a really nice launchpad to success. So like we said before, it's very funny to see, Andrew, how one thing can influence the one way or another, sometimes an advantage, sometimes a disadvantage, sometimes you don't even know. So yeah,
but it's a deeper point of why you need diversity on your team. If you're an Israeli, like there's, if you guys listen to episode 3 of the podcast, we featured 50-50 Startups, which is an incubation and accelerator program that's based in Israel that forms teams of Israelis, Arab Israelis, and Palestinians, and then helps them launch a product to market. And when you have something like that, you're able to navigate different politics and relationships in a much different way. And if you have a diverse team, you might be aware of product market fit you have in other countries that if you didn't have, someone from Saudi Arabia on your team, or if you didn't have, someone from Cairo or Egypt on your team, you might not be aware that you can launch into that market. And then you might not be able to launch into that market because you don't speak the local language and you don't have the local partners and connections. And so,
I agree.
Yeah, if you all take away one thing from this talk and this specific series, It's that like we're in a globalized world. Markets are slowly starting to come together. Even in the MENA region, one of the things we touch on is the fact that regulations are getting a little bit friendlier. I'm super sympathetic to entrepreneurs there because I'm sitting here in the US where I have this huge market that I don't have to worry about, once I raise like a Series A or a Series B, like the country that I'm operating in just isn't even big enough to provide the customer base for me to hit venture scale, right? And so just the importance of diverse teams is something that is like Eli and I can't, even though we're two white guys, we can't hammer that point hard enough. Is that something you take into account? Like, is there any diverse? I guess it's hard to quantify that, but is there any way you take that into account in the platform in Starblink?
Yeah, not so much because first of all, it's hard to quantify. And second of all, once again, the idea is that we're looking less about what makes an ecosystem successful and checking more the results. So I also think that diversification is going to greatly increase chances of success of startups. But what we're going to measure is how successful they are, and not necessarily why is it. Was it the investor? Was it the diversification? Was it the low cost of living? So the idea is that the reasons we leave a little bit behind, and we're actually measuring the result or seeing what is the final score, let's say. But my intuition is that you're totally right. The more diversified is your team, the more open-minded it is. We just have to, we have to let go of misconceptions. We have to keep an open mind because our startup is now a new universe. And whenever we're starting a new startup, we have to keep an open mind and kind of say, you know what don't I know about the world, and how don't I get my opinions to disturb me as I'm building my startup? Because at the end of the day, building something like that is totally new requires a lot of creativity. It requires your best energy. And this energy has to do with opening your mind to the world, because the opportunities are basically there. So
yeah, for sure. So a stat that super like really surprised me that I just learned about the past couple weeks is that here in the US, over 50%, the majority of people actually don't have a passport. How crazy! Like I had no idea that was the case. And so when I first started the Global Startup Movement podcast, you have these stereotypes and you have these conceptions of different regions, different countries. Saudi Arabia is this way, Nigeria is this way. Like you have these conceptions in your mind that might be programmed through media or, your families and friends. But then when you travel to those countries, like you start to realize that, like everybody is just some dude or some chick, like we're all just the same. Like even the most important minister or president or CEO of this or that, it's just some dude or some chick, like everybody and so we need to really break down the barriers that we have in our own minds and the misconceptions that we have of them versus us. Because whatever them versus us narrative that you're believing in, like I promise you, it's not true.
I can't agree more. I think most people don't really care about us, and it's in a good way. Like at the end of the day, everyone is fighting their own battle. In this life, everyone's trying to build their own thing, and of course, I really believe that if we're all active. Once again, going back to the point of building a startup, being active, good things are going to happen. And that's basically how we take control of our destiny, of our financial future, of our legacy as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I just saw in the comments, someone asked if I'm drinking alcohol. No, I'm not. This is actually really strong tea with this special straw. So I don't drink the tea leaves. So no alcohol. It's still 8:46 a.m. my time. So if I was drinking alcohol, you guys should probably, are you okay, Andrew? It's just tea. It's just tea. So guys, we have about 9 more minutes here with Eli. So feel free to ask any questions that you have in the chat. Our next session coming up is with John Lyndon, for the executive director for the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And we're going to be diving deeper into this conversation of more social programs or more private sector funds. It's a yes and, it's not a yes or. But John is a super educated expert on both sides of the coin. He's been working in Israel and Palestine for a long time. But Eli, before I am done with you, I want to learn more about your digital nomad life. And I want to learn more about where you see, like from the digital nomad lens, what are some of the most exciting ecosystems in the Middle East for you? And where would you, if you had to choose somewhere in the MENA region, not Israel, by the way, where would you set up shop?
Yeah, no, that's great. So basically, I've been traveling in the last 10 years. I'm moving between places every 2 or 3 months, ever since I started Startup Link and another startup that I had in the past. So I'm a true believer in exactly what you said, Andrew, in moving and seeing, getting exposed to new experiences. You learn a lot about the world, and you learn exactly the lessons that you mentioned, Andrew. We're all pretty much the same. So it's kind of like something that is interesting, all the concept that we have about countries and politics. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, when you move a lot, you can kind of like enjoy what's happening in the world and kind of get more into it. So that's my lifestyle in the last 10 years. Ecosystems that, and by the way, the startup lifestyle, this is one of the biggest advantages of the startup lifestyle, basically allowing you to build your own virtual empire, right? So be in a situation that you can work on it, it doesn't matter from where, and kind of like work on it from the Canary Islands or from Saloniki, where I was before, and so on. That's definitely something that I recommend for people to do. It's even doable in COVID time if you do it responsibly, but of course, much easier when we're finally are after this crisis. But yeah, as for the ecosystems in the Middle East, I think the ones that are most interesting for me is, first of all, Cairo. I think the potential there is massive, and Cairo used to be the center of the Arab world, and I do think that, and once again, I have to check where they ranked, because they're not in the rankings that I showed you, because they're ranked in North Africa. But Cairo is definitely one ecosystem that I'm really interested in. I've heard really good things about Amman, and I think Amman has a lot of potential, super sharp people. Beirut, without a doubt, another great ecosystem that I think has a potential of being a bridge between Europe and the Middle East. So definitely Beirut would be high on my list. And Dubai, of course. So those are like the top ones. But I think every city is so interesting in its own way that it's interesting to see that it's not only the capital cities or the main cities. Some very interesting things are happening also on the regional cities, on the smaller, let's say, locations. Over there, you can see a lot of innovation as well. So if I could, I would go to all of them, but for the future.
Well, how has COVID changed it? Like has it changed it at all for you? Because now, like I keep hammering this away. Like good internet and good weather are like, you know, the things now.
Yeah, I think COVID basically created a situation where I have to tell you also, moving around is not as fun as it used to be, because the social element, I don't speak necessarily about the bureaucracy and doing PCR tests before you move between locations and so on. I'm talking more, I should have been now, by the way, in Ethiopia, because we have a project with the World Bank, and I should have done a lot of research in Ethiopia right now, but everything is online. You are losing something here. I do think that the human connection element has become a little bit more scarce now. People are not that interested in meeting a lot of strangers. Everyone is kind of staying with their, with their nuclear family in a way. So it does reduce a little bit from the ability to experience, but other options are happening now. For example, I've been a few times in Clubhouse checking it out. There are really amazing rooms, by the way, in Arabic in Clubhouse. I recommend people. Currently, it's only blocked for iPhone, but I totally recommend people to join the discussion. A lot of them are in Arabic. So I do think a lot of the community element, and I'm saying this unfortunately, is moving online, and the physical world is losing a little bit of its glamour. And I'm hoping we can get back to it, because the real high quality connections are still going to happen in face-to-face encounters. So that's, although you and I, Andrew, are good friends and we never met each other. So this is an example of how you can actually create those connections.
Dude, I can't tell you how many people that are just like us. Like even my partner over the past couple of years, like we still haven't met, it's all online. But I think that the next step for all of us is the metaverse. I don't know if you've ever read the book Snow Crash. But it's a really, love it. But that's where we're going, man. We just got our new Oculus Quest 2, having a lot of fun in VR, trying to be productive and stay in the real world. But until we get into the metaverse and we're all, interacting with each other in VR, these virtual events just aren't really cutting it. But we'll get there, Eli. Don't worry.
Super, that's great. But let's keep a little bit of space for the physical world as well, to meet people, to go out
Yeah,
to
no, I'm
nature.
open.
Always good.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm open. I'm open. I'm open. I just, I'm not burning through my travel budget like I usually am because, as you know, I travel a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, and that eats up my travel budget like you would not believe. Which, by the way, Ethiopia you mentioned, it's my new favorite African country. Used to be Kenya. Sorry, Kenyans, but Ethiopia. Addis treated me so well. The coffee's great, architecture's great, history's great, the people are beautiful. So shout out Ethiopia.
Nice, that's great.
All right, guys, we have a couple more minutes and then I'm going to bring John to the stage. I see John down there. Hello, John. Eli, any parting words, anything you want to sign off with? And by the way, while you are, do you want to bring up on your screen the Middle East rankings one more time? So we can take a look at it.
So let me have a quick look. Yeah, I'm going to share it. Yeah, close thoughts as I'm sharing my screen. Let me just find it. Is that I do recommend for everyone, don't wait for anyone else and just build your thing. Whatever you're building, don't wait too much and just build it, because at the end of the day, it all depends on us. It all depends on our, let's say, ability to innovate. And great things can happen just by us being active and not waiting for anyone else to set the path. So that's my main message. Yeah.
Great. Well, guys, here's the money shot. Eli, thank you for joining us today, and thank you so much for pulling these rankings for us. I think it's super interesting to see where we're at right now. I was really surprised to see Saudi Arabia so low on the list. Super bullish on Saudi, super bullish on Lebanon. And I realized that most of the diaspora, the MENA diaspora here in the US, they're either Egyptian or they're either Lebanese. So I would love to see more connections being formed between the US-based diasporans and people back home, invest back home. And the bravest thing that you can do is go start a business back home for sure. And we're going to have Ursula Wegzernovich from the US Export-Import Bank later on today. And she's going to cover some of the credit, risk, and financing tools that they provide to US-based citizens, which is available to all the diaspora here in the US. But Eli, thank you so much for joining us today.
Andrew, thanks for inviting me. Always a pleasure to see your work, and keep it up.
Absolutely. All right. All right, everybody. So we're going to go on to our next session. We have John, who is the executive director for the Middle East Alliance for Peace. I'm John. I'm going to bring you to the stage. Welcome. Ooh, looking good, man. Thanks for, I'm assuming you dressed up just for us.
Yes, maybe some other calls today that demand
but awesome. Well, John's with us today, and we're going to dive into the question of where does the capital go? Do we need more social programs in the region to ensure stability, or should we be focused on private sector, SME, and VC funds? And I see about 54 of you guys over on YouTube. Feel free to pop on over to Hopin. That's where we have all of our networking sessions. And again, guys, I kept that list very, very highly curated. So you can ensure that if you pop into that networking feature, you're going to have a very high quality person on the other end that's some kind of stakeholder in the MENA ecosystem, whether they're ecosystem builder, VC, entrepreneur, whoever that might be. So John, why don't you just kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization, ALLMEP, and then we'll get into things.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. So yeah, my name is John Lyndon. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And we're the largest network of peace-building NGOs working amongst Israelis and Palestinians, but increasingly actually across the wider Middle East as well. And we work in the region with our members, over 130 of them now, to try and encourage cooperation, innovation, to try and see the best practices and new programmatic innovations be introduced into the Israeli-Palestinian peace-building realm. We also advocate to governments right around the world in order to increase funding for peace-building in general amongst Israelis and Palestinians. And as part of that advocacy, we managed to help secure, thanks to incredible congressional leadership last year in the United States, the introduction of something called the Nida M. Lowy Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which is a $250 million 5-year investment in both civic people-to-people peace building of the kind that characterizes most of our members, but also projects and initiatives that can help to support the Palestinian private sector and increase partnerships between the Palestinian private sector, their counterparts in Israel, and of course the wider Middle East.
Awesome. Well, congrats on that. I actually didn't know that went through. So really, that's really cool. And John, we want to make this a super interactive session. And so I want to kind of reflect and maybe touch on some of the themes that we touched on during your podcast interview. For everyone listening that wasn't able to catch it, John was featured in episode 3 of our podcast series. And one thing that he mentioned during the podcast interview is that he obviously spends a lot of time traveling in the region, and he meets many young people in the region who have these amazing ideas that are just held back by some of the dysfunctional political realities that they have around them. And so, John, I'd be curious in your travels, how different of a lens do you feel is there between the youth and kind of the older people in the region, and how they see conflict and how to solve it? Because I mean, my sense is that younger people in the region are just so focused on startups, ideas, and they're inspired by really the access to technology that they have at their disposal. And they just want to move on the political strife so that they could start their business, So I'd be curious to hear in your experience in the region, what is the kind of, how big is the gap generationally in how they view these issues?
I mean, the generational gap in the Middle East, generally speaking, is enormous. It's probably the biggest I've seen anywhere. I mean, even just in pure demography, it's an incredibly young region that tends not to have incredibly young political or even economic leadership at the very, very elite level. So you have large number of graduates coming out, particularly in ICT qualifications, looking for capital, looking to try and find a platform to launch an initiative, and I guess struggling against some of the systemic issues. And this is much bigger than the Israeli-Palestinian realm, but it's around sort of, bureaucracy, sort of infrastructural issues. And again, it varies from Morocco in the west all the way to Iran in the east, I guess. And there's a lot of subjectivity in each realm. But one thing that you do find in most of the territories that I visited, at least, is a very impatient and incredibly ambitious and talented youth cohort who are coming up with great ideas and innovations and maybe struggling with some of those structural issues. You are seeing variance. Now, in the Israeli-Palestinian realm, which I work in most, in a concentrated sense, there is a conflict. I mean, there's an ongoing military occupation, an ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, which creates an extra layer of political dysfunction and, unfortunately, structural difficulties with the partnerships that may otherwise emerge. And it can be frustrating. You meet young Palestinian entrepreneurs and graduates who I think can go toe-to-toe with their peers anywhere in the world very often, but they're working in an environment where, first of all, international capital flows simply aren't there for you. The political risk is far too great for most investors to come in. You also have issues, many of which aren't actually related to the conflict, but are related to structural inefficiencies within the Palestinian economy, many of which then are obviously related to the conflict, and then social norms that prevent or sometimes discourage partnership across the Green Line with Israelis. And this is one of the things that perhaps the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act will attempt to kind of disrupt. Because on the one hand, you have Israel, which is an OECD economy, which is a hub for innovation, not just in the region, but really globally, sitting next to an unusually talented, educated, and literate Arab population in the region as a whole. Palestinians historically have been one of the nations within the wider Middle East who have been at the forefront of business and innovation, from the Gulf, Jordan, Egypt, elsewhere. And you have this structural impediment to the kind of partnerships that would definitely evolve if the politics were organized in a different way. So we're trying to make those connections to encourage, I guess, government lines of capital and investment to try and substitute things that the market are not providing, and then going one layer out, trying to connect the young people from the wider region to their peers in Israel and in Palestine, which again, there's been far too little of. Very often Palestinians will travel to the Gulf, very often stay there, work there, attain quite high leadership levels in business and finance and in many different sectors. But you don't see organically the connections being created that is often the case with diaspora communities back to the West Bank and Gaza. So that's something that can be engineered, that there is goodwill from many other Arab states to try and put together. And of course, with the Abraham Accords last year, you now have one of the other structural impediments to capital, ideas, and people flowing from the GCC to Israel removed. So we think there's a moment of opportunity, and particularly a moment of opportunity because of the change in administration in the United States and with the Biden administration coming in to try and potentially leverage or work with the new territory opened up by the Abraham Accords, but to bring the conflict into it as part of it, to use these dynamics, these business, economic, and civic vectors as tools to try and solve or at least push back some of the most negative and dysfunctional elements of the conflict. And that's quite exciting. That's genuinely something that we've never seen in this space before.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think there's a lot of momentum concurrently between the political side with the Abraham Accords and on the startup ecosystem side, as we touched on earlier with Eli. Like a lot of the ecosystems, especially in Saudi Arabia and even Kuwait, they're gaining a lot of momentum. They're creating a lot of venture capital. There's a lot of freelancing activity. There's a lot of startup activity that's just starting to crop up. I think specifically, like if you think outside of politics, the economic sanctions is a really tricky thing. Because like when you think about the fintech ecosystem, that's kind of like the most basic infrastructure that needs to be laid in order for digital commerce to flourish. If a freelancer in Palestine can't accept payment through PayPal, it's not appropriate. We have the tools to provide proper KYC, proper know your customer standards. And there's no reason why young people who are just born in the wrong country, whether that be Iran, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to access the digital economy in the same way that all of us, here in the US or in Israel, UAE are able to. So John, do you think that when we talk about private sector funds in some of the conflict zones, like, are we getting too ahead of ourselves by like wanting to invest like a lot of money into like a VC or an SME fund in those countries before we kind of like properly get the social, norms and the social programs in place so that there's at least stability in the business environment? Like, is that getting too ahead of ourselves? Or like, do you think, like when you think about the way the US developed in the late 19th, early 20th century, we had a private sector that kind of emerged and was able to provide some friction against the public sector. And that's how proper regulations and a proper regulatory and compliance framework is able to be formed. So yeah, no, I'm throwing a lot at you, but like, where are we at with like potentially putting the cart before the horse?
It's a really important question. And it's important to say that all of these economic tools, as powerful as they are and how much they can move the needle, none of them can solve the conflict. I think it's really, really important for people to be clear-eyed about that. Now, what they can do is provide a stake for individuals. They can provide more resources for growth. They can provide jobs, which in itself very often produces stability. The thing that excites me most about it is that it can provide a forum for younger people to self-actualize. What we have, and it's not a problem unique to the Middle East, but it is quite acute in the Middle East and certainly in Palestine, is a generational divide where a lot of the power, resources, and sort of ideas are kind of the preserve of a certain demographic, and you have the largest part of the society. I mean, in the West Bank, the average age is 22. In Gaza, it's 16. These are very young societies that are a little bit marginalized, and that can go in very dysfunctional directions unless it's mitigated in some way. And I think the private sector and investment and the innovation and rapid transformation associated with technology provides the most effective and kind of democratized way for that to take place in a broad way in the West Bank and Gaza. And what it can do then is, number one, help to shape the kind of leaders, ideas, and innovations that can then tackle the political issues, perhaps with a new guise, right? I mean, I think we've tried to solve this problem in a very similar way over and over again, and found that we're coming up against similar roadblocks over and over. In fact, maybe we're moving backwards. So I think new ideas, a new generation being able to develop leadership skills, resources, networks that they can leverage towards ending the conflict is important. But then also the economic ties that can be created across the region. And this goes beyond the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's an incredibly subdivided, and if you want to put it in regulatory terms, it's a very varied regulatory environment, right? Where it's very subjective to not even just on a national level, but a sub-national level within governance and individual territories. And I think that needs to be flattened a little bit. I mean, at risk of wanting to sound like a campaigning neoliberal, there is a huge potential to try and weave back together a Middle East that did exist for a very long time, that was much more integrated than the one we find today. And that goes with regards to investment, with ideas, with people being able to move across borders. And, again, while I'm leaning into being naive, Europe was very segmented for a very long time, heavily regulated with a lot of protectionism between different economies. And we've seen over the last half century or so how creating a single economic area, a single regulatory system, has unlocked greater efficiencies, has drawn in further foreign direct investment, has created many more value-add businesses on the continent of Europe than existed before, and created much better quality of life for Europeans as well. And in many ways, the Middle East is better suited to this than Europe is. It's a much more historically integrated place with fewer linguistic or cultural barriers. And I think, as you said at the top, you're seeing a lot of commonality emerge organically, socially, amongst the kind of millennial generation across the region, the embracing of certain technology. I think the biggest impediment beyond the conflict that we spoke about is actually economic in a class-based way. So how equally are these dividends being shared across these societies? Because we're coming from an environment that is already quite hierarchical, there is sort of an unjust allocation of resources within societies. One of the subversive things that legislation such as the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act and also just smart private sector investment could do is try and more equally distribute some of these resources and access to information. And that in itself, number one, it will create far greater regional stability. Number two, much greater interstate networks on a social level, but then also a much stronger vector for the kind of disassembly of the national barriers that have existed up until now, because you're seeing it happen amongst, say, emerging journalists, entrepreneurs, people in the academy organically, where they're finding each other online, they're developing networks, they're sometimes producing products and innovation together. But if you suddenly put your thumb on the scale and provided like a choreographed funding or sort of political or economic incentive for that to happen, I think it could take place quite rapidly. And then finally, for the universities to be part of it. Universities in the Middle East, with the exception of certain Gulf actors, are chronically underfunded. And there was an opportunity, I think, here to be able to create some hubs for innovation at the university sector, and then work to try and get more young people from across the region from different socioeconomic backgrounds into universities. And that's actually a much more cost-effective way of doing this sometimes. And I think it's underdeveloped. These hubs are there. Very often they've been around for over a century. They just are starved of national support. But it's something that the international community and the private sector could help to incentivize.
Yeah, I think universities are a key catalyst point, or can be a key catalyst point in the region. And it's something we actually touched on in episode 6 of our podcast miniseries. The fact that a lot of the diaspora, if you look at the big success stories of the MENA startup ecosystem, a lot of them were educated at Stanford, or they went to New York or whatever, and they were exposed to this whole new culture that completely changed the trajectory of their life. Like, one of the big exits is Cloudera, and Cloudera is like a multi $100 million exit, and started by someone in the MENA diaspora. And she went to Stanford for the purpose of becoming a computer science teacher back home, and just the culture of Stanford and the Silicon Valley entrepreneurship spirit. He caught the bug. He started a company, and he had one of the biggest exits of any Middle East diaspora in the world. And so universities forming partnerships with global universities like Cambridge, Stanford, Oxford, that's key in exposing your youth to this kind of different mindset that we have, in the Silicon Valley-esque ecosystems. That's just not really present in the region. That is changing, though. I think, a lot of times on the podcast when we talk about culture, we're too negative. It's actually better than, it's a better. And startups are now a sexier thing than they ever have been. And so I actually don't think culture is the biggest issue at this point. I think the regulatory integration, like you talked about, is the Middle East is in a much more advantageous position than Europe to actually create one unified market. Because the problem with Europe is, even if you get everything into one market, in Germany, everyone speaks German. In France, everyone speaks French. In Spain, everyone speaks Spanish. And so even if you get things regulatory, clumped together, you still have such different dichotomies in cultures and languages and product market fit across different countries. I have a lot of sympathy for European entrepreneurs. It's a really tough thing to do. And it's a tough thing to scale up on that continent.
100%. But then you still see, in relative terms, far fewer Arabic language applications, for example, on iOS being released, despite the fact that there is, demographically, the core demographic that would be engaging with those more highly represented across the Middle East and North Africa than almost anywhere else. Like you said, linguistic, not quite homogeneity, but certainly a lot of commonality, and also huge cell phone take up. Right, it's one of the most saturated environments in the world now at this point. So a lot of the prerequisites that are required are there. It feels like it just needs a concerted effort. And you mentioned diaspora communities earlier, and I think that can be really key. And we have anecdotal evidence, certainly on the entrepreneurship side of things, and definitely in both Israel and Palestine, of diaspora communities helping to spur some of the most important innovations, incubators, partnerships that you see between the river and the sea. And I would love to see, and this is obviously our hobby horse at ALLMEP, that being leveraged towards the political piece as well. We've seen in other conflicts how diaspora communities, there's different ways to engage with your identity if you no longer live in the country of origin. One of them is sometimes to become sort of more I hesitate to use the word, but more extreme than people on the ground, because you're sort of, you feel like you're supporting a football team from a distance. Another way to do it, however, is to recognize your privilege, not living in the conflict anymore, and to be able to actually leverage that towards new ideas and new innovations. Now, we saw that happen in Northern Ireland in a really interesting way in both the private sector and the sort of civil society part, where the Irish diaspora in America, which numbered over 40 million people, went from supporting, say, raising money for weapons for the IRA towards actually incentivizing peace building and setting up businesses and putting their own money on the table, taking on the risk to be able to support the private sector in Northern Ireland. And there's no reason in the world that couldn't be the role for Israeli and Palestinian diaspora and for the wider diaspora in the region. And I think maybe an organizing structure is kind of what's required, right? These things are happening organically in a piecemeal way, but to try and find an umbrella or some sort of an organizing entity that can make them more than the sum of their parts, and take advantage of some of the existing capital lines coming from governments and from different investment initiatives, because at the moment they're being distributed in a piecemeal way. But if you add them all together, it's actually quite a significant dollar amount every year. The problem is that it's not in service of any one clear strategy. It's kind of diffused. And diaspora communities could help to drive that strategy, right? They have the legitimacy, the local knowledge, and also that international network where they can liaise with donor countries and investment firms, while simultaneously working, for want of a better phrase, in the retail end of it in the region. And it's a pivotal role, and really only diaspora communities could play it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's very different when you have a diaspora, and because they're super plugged in locally, they understand the local culture, language, context, and they have the international network because they live in the US. And so it's not, white guy Andrew or white guy John coming in with some money and it's something where this idea of nationalism is it's a double-edged sword. When you think about who has the strongest startup ecosystems in the world, it's countries that have the most and highest nationalism. It's Brazil, it's the US, it's Nigeria, it's Israel, it's China. And I think a part of that is the fact that when you think about the angel investor community, if someone is willing to take a bet for the broader good of the country, because that's kind of the spirit you have to have as an angel investor, because most of your bets are going to fall flat. And you have to have this kind of this is for the greater good. This is going to seed a multiplier effect in a very powerful way. And I'm also okay if I lose this $50,000 because it's a startup, and startups fail almost all the time. Even Uber, it's not a profitable company, and so it's I think nationalism specifically is a tricky thing in the region, where you don't want too much, you don't want too little, you just want that Goldilocks.
Yeah, nationalism is the way it most often manifests itself, particularly in the last sort of decade or two, I guess. But it's a convening idea, right? So it can be the idea of nation, and there's nothing wrong with it being that. But it can also be something, beyond the bottom line, something that creates common identity. And it can be around values as much as national identity. It can be on an overall strategic purpose. And what's interesting, when we talk about trying to create a more flat economic environment in the Middle East, that rubs up against the idea of nationalism slightly, right? So you could almost create, and I wouldn't be leaning back into ideas of pan-Arabism, but some sort of an identity that's more cosmopolitan in the Middle East. Again, as an outsider looking in, but somebody who travels there very, very frequently, that's maybe based around age, right? About this kind of coming demographic of young, innovative people who want to create those kind of relationships across these territories, want to solve some of the very big common problems in the region, whether it's ethnic and sectarian conflict, climate change, water scarcity. These are all these problems that no individual nation state in the Middle East has the capacity to solve on their own. And that, frankly, from a younger generation's perspective, the older leaders have kind of failed in being able to address, and they're not alone in that, that's also a failure in the West. So you could almost create a common youth identity around the region, converging on those big, meaty problems and technological and innovative solutions to be able to tackle them. And it wouldn't contradict national identity or pride, but would sum up to something that's a little bit more than each of the individual nationalistic parts.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I think startups, like obviously I'm biased. I run the Global Startup Movement podcast, but I think startups is the vehicle for peace, because it's the ability to view these things through a completely different lens, through a completely bottom up, kind of democratized, decentralized lens. And it's really powerful. It's really powerful. So guys, we have about 10 minutes left here with John. I see about 96 of you now watching over on YouTube. Feel free to hop over into Hopin, which is our virtual event platform that is facilitating all of the virtual one-on-one networking. And that's the goal for today. And that's the goal really for my platform. I want to really connect people through the lens of startups. And that can be a unifying force for the world, because we all want the same things. We all want the 10x returns. We all want the digital economy flourishing in our country. And I think that can be a unifying force. So John, is there anything we didn't touch on today, or anything else that you want to make sure that we cover?
Yeah, just, I mean, sometimes there's kind of a wall seen between sort of civic or non-sustainable initiatives, right, that are philanthropic in the way that they're often financed, and then the startup community, which is, ultimately at some point has a profit incentive. And I guess it's just to put the idea out there to maybe not view them as such distinct categories. I think everything that you're saying about the power really of startups, Andrew, that bottom up way, that innovation that it brings to the table, that can also be absorbed into the sort of civil society or peace building frame. And it's a very interesting skill set when I observe people that have it, that come into our realm, the innovation they bring, the problem solving, it's really refreshing. And then the converse is also true, right? That if you're working for an organization, or you've got an idea that is essentially, it's a business, and you're looking to return a profit to yourself or to your investors, to see how maybe that civic element can be integrated as well. And I think it's particularly true across the Middle East. There is, no shortage of cool ideas out there, entrepreneurs that are pushing together new investment initiatives, new business propositions, but finding a way to be able to couple it with solving some of the big problems in the region. And then we can begin to have that engine of innovation and sustainability that is associated with the startup culture be absorbed a little bit more into that, not just peace building, but whatever social, political problems are being dealt with across the region. I think it's not only a more varied and more interesting kind of heterogeneous mix of different tools, but it can also bring some of those economic entrepreneurs, I guess, into the political realm over the medium to long term. And this is something that's actually required, right? So there is a history across the Middle East and across Europe from much of the time beforehand of commerce and business being in one category, and then sort of policy and politics being in another. And I think we understand that those categories are kind of amorphous, and the lines between them are really blurred. And the countries that are getting it right very often are pulling the utility from these different sectors and creating hybrid models. And the Middle East is more well positioned than other places to be able to do that, because of the sort of the proximity of some of the political and economic elites, because, as we mentioned, about the demographic reality coming up underneath, but also because of the problems being faced over the medium to long term. Ultimately, if you want to build a thriving business in the Middle East, whether it's climate change, sectarian conflict, youth unemployment, those are things that are going to affect your business eventually over time as well. They aren't political or social problems. They're existential problems for the region if we want to create a thriving middle class and jobs and security and forward momentum for the generation that's coming up.
Awesome. So, John, before we let you go, tell us, so we have so much momentum, it feels like, being built from the Abraham Accords. We have UAE, Bahrain, Egypt is already there, Morocco, all establishing economic normalized ties with Israel. We have a new administration. We have a lot of momentum, specifically in the startup ecosystem and the collaboration that's starting to form there. Just from your perspective and with the conversations you're having within your network, like, what can we expect over the next 4 years? And I'm hoping your answer is super positive and hopeful.
I mean, I think we're going to see a more gradual approach on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, perhaps than was attempted by the Trump administration over the last few years, and a more incremental kind of grassroots bottom-up approach, which I believe is exactly the right one to take. I mean, we've a reality right now, just to step away from economics for a second, where 90% of Palestinians think it's impossible to trust Israeli Jews, 79% of Israeli Jews think it's impossible to trust Palestinians. That's what we have to fix. Right? And there's economic, civic, political, social levers toward a goal where you can begin to create the trust that is necessary for any real meaningful swing of conflict resolution. And I think that these countries in this sort of outer concentric circle in the region, whether those who have signed up to the Abraham Accords or those that haven't, they have a role to play in being able to support and incentivize that sort of dynamic. And I think it really goes beyond politics. Like, it doesn't particularly matter what you think the solution to the conflict should be, where you think a border should be, if there should be a border. All of those things are important, but they're downstream from those attitudes that we spoke about. And every single country in the Middle East and North Africa has an interest in Israelis and Palestinians' attitudes being diametrically opposed to where they are now. The good things that will flow from that in conflict resolution, in business and security will all accrue for the entire region. And I think we should find that as a center point, as non-divisive, bipartisan, inclusive point of consensus. We can agree on other things, disagree on other things rather, but if we can find the region, Europe, North America, all agreeing that that's a priority, we're going to fund it, we're going to finance it and incentivize it. If we are patient, things will get better year upon year rather than worse, which is the dynamic we've been in for the last decade or two.
Awesome. Well, John, if anyone wants to connect with you or your organization, what's the best way for all of us to do that?
Yeah, you can drop me an email. It's John, JOHN, at ALLMEP.org. Check out our website, www.allmep.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. You can find us, the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And do feel free to get in touch. We always love to hear interesting new ideas, innovation, and again, sort of walk the walk to open ourselves and the peace building community more up to some of the dynamism that's taking place in the private sector and across the region.
Great. Well, John, we really appreciate your participation in the virtual summit and in our podcast. If you guys did not tune into John's podcast episode, he was featured in episode 3 on our topic of Israel economic normalization in the region. But John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Take care.
All right, everybody. So we are about to get into the finals of Pitch MENA Live. Again, guys, Pitch MENA Live is our 16 startup live stream pitch competition. The teams have been battling for these final 2 spots. We've had essentially an American Idol format for the first 4 rounds. We featured some fintech startups, e-commerce, education, and agriculture tech startups, all focused on the Middle East and North Africa region. And so today we will have 2 Shark Tank style pitches. We'll have one AlGuru startup. AlGuru is based in Saudi Arabia. They're an ed tech company, and they're going to be our first startup that comes up on the screen in about 5 minutes, guys. I'm going to pop on over to a different live stream. So I'm going to put this up for now, and I will see you guys in about 5 minutes for the first of our Pitch MENA Live final pitch.